You can look up the homunculi online and see what they're like, but I'll show you they're sort of stretched out weirdly along here. That would be the motor one, and then along here that would be the sensory one. And you can kind of detect with your own consciousness how your body is represented in your brain. So for example, can I get you to stand up if you would? Let's turn around. Okay, so how many fingers on your back?
5.
Okay. All right, why? Low resolution. He's like on his back is like a low resolution array of pixels, right? And so it's virtually impossible. You just don't have enough sensory tissue on your back to make that. You could tell I was pushing, but it could have been a bat, it could have been 5 fingers, it doesn't matter. Maybe your pixel is this big or something like that, right? And so, but if I put a finger on your lip like that, man, you've got it right now, or on your tongue, because your tongue, there's more sensory representation of your tongue than your entire trunk. And well, why? Well, you don't want to bite your tongue. That's a big problem. You have to be able to talk. You want to really differentiate what you're eating. If you're eating fish, you don't want to eat the bones. So, and your tongue is unbelievably, crazily sensitive. And you know that too, that if you have a tooth pulled, your tongue will investigate that area for like 6 months. You're sitting there, your attention wanes, and your tongue is in there like mapping, like mad, mapping that little hole to update your body representation, right? And it's just this crazy thing that is unbelievably well represented from the sensory perspective and also from the motor perspective, because you can manipulate your tongue like crazy. It's like a quarter of your motor output system is devoted to tongue manipulation, right? And so here's a picture of the homunculus. This is a motor homunculus. So, and that's what your brain thinks of your body. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so that's what a human being is like in terms of his or her output. And so what you see, if you look at a sensory homunculus, it's quite similar, except the feet are bigger, the genitalia are bigger logically. They don't have much motor utility, but they have a lot of sensory utility. But the rest of it's quite similar. So there's, the motor and the sensory homunculus are quite similar. But I'm going to talk about the motor homunculus because it's sort of the action representation. Well, so what are human beings like? Well, we're all hands. That's the first thing. And if you do that, it's unbelievably high resolution, your fingertips and that's sensory. But we can manipulate our hands like crazy, like they're unbelievably articulated, right? And that's the thing that makes us able to change the world. It makes us what dolphins aren't. And so a huge part of our brain is devoted towards being able to move our hands. That enables us to take things apart and put them together. And then once we learn to take things apart and put them together, we can talk about how we do that. And that's a lot of what we're doing, and that's the hands and the mouth and the tongue, roughly speaking. Here's how I took something apart, chaos. Here's what I made out of it, order. Here's how I did it. And then you receive that, and you're happy about it, and then you can do the same thing. And that's imitation facilitated by language. It's like, here's what I did with my body. I'm propagating it across space. You're taking it, mapping it onto your body. Now you can do the same thing. Yeah, and that's, it might be simple, like this is how you pick up a rock, but it might be complicated, like here's how you go after the dragon of chaos, right? And so it sort of maps onto that hierarchy, this thing that we've talked about in some detail. This, when you're telling a story to people, when you're informing them about something, you can talk to them at a very high level of resolution, which you do with your child. Here's how you slice up some broccoli, right? But then you move up the abstraction and say, here's how you act like a civilized person at the dinner table, right? And that's part of being a good person. So you can tell stories about, I just went and saw Logan, which I really liked, by the way. It's super violent, but I really did like it. It's got a very elegant mythological structure, which is not surprising. But there's a scene in this Logan movie, it's not a spoiler, he has this child with him who has who's been raised roughly in a laboratory, and she has absolutely no table manners. And so they're sitting at a dinner with some people that they've run into, and she's eating like a total barbarian, and of course everybody's eyebrows are raised, like, where did this person come from? So the fact that that high order behavior isn't there is something that's of extraordinary interest to everyone. And so, you know, you teach your children micro strategies and you teach them macro strategies. Some of the macro strategies you're teaching them you don't even understand, because you know the strategies, they're built into you because of an evolutionary process, roughly speaking. And you say things like, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game, and you don't understand what that means, although you know it's right, and you try to act that out for your children, and they incorporate it in their action even though they can't represent it. They cannot come up with a fully articulated representation of what that means. And so they're like children, the Piagetian children. Children can only play by themselves to begin with, while they're integrating themselves internally. Then they start to play in parallel with other children. So you're two. You play your game, that child plays his or her game. A little interaction, but you can't unite the games. Then you're between 2 and 4, you start to be able to unite the games. And you can either do that by acting them out. You can do this even with a younger child. They can catch peekaboo very rapidly. But once you're between 2 and 4 and you start getting linguistic, you could start saying, well, let's play this game. And that means we're going to unite our attention towards a particular goal. We're going to unite our motor activity and maybe cooperate and compete towards that goal. It's the beginning of the social structure. It's the beginning of the social structure. And you get really good at that between 2 and 4. But you don't necessarily know what you're doing. You can't say it. So Piaget's experiments indicated that if you take children, maybe they've got to the point where they can play quite a social game, maybe they're 5 or 6, they're playing marbles. You take them out of the game and you say, okay, tell me the rules of the game of marbles. They give incoherent representations. Why? Because their behavior is more sophisticated than their representation. You see, as soon as you understand that, that is a wild thing to understand, because it answers the question, for example, how can you have dreams that tell you things you don't know? You think, well, how the hell can that possibly be? You're coming up with the damn dream. How can the dream tell you things you don't know? Or analogously, how can people tell stories that contain information that they don't understand? And the answer is that information is coded in our behavior. Okay, so we'll go back to a chimpanzee troop. All the chimpanzees in the troop know the dominance hierarchy structure. But if you take a chimpanzee out from the troop and say, what's the dominance structure? The chimpanzee is going to do whatever a chimpanzee does. It's not going to have a little conversation with you about the nature of the dominance hierarchy. So it can act out its knowledge, and it might even be able to represent it in image, but it can't articulate it. Well, why would we be any different? We aren't, obviously, because we're more complex than we understand. So the fact that we're more complex than we understand means that we contain information that we cannot articulate. Why can't that reveal itself? It does all the time. You have a revelation. It's aha, I get it. Well, what is that? Maybe you're in psychotherapy and we talk about some things about your past and we say, well, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. We say, look, there's a pattern, whap! And it's overwhelming. It's like now there's a concordance between your knowledge and the things that you're acting out. And that's what comes as a revelation. So one of the things that happens in Exodus, Moses is leading his people through the deserts. Classic U-shaped story. They're in a tyranny to begin with, right? So that's the insufficient present. That's the old order. Then they cross the water, the destructive water. That's chaos, like the flood. Then they're out in the desert, wandering without direction. They start worshiping idols. They're wandering without direction. And then Moses goes up on the mountain, which is, by the way, what happens in Logan, just because if you're going to go see it, you might as well know that, because it's a journey up a mountain. He goes up the mountain and he gets rules revealed to him. Well, the way the story is structured is extraordinarily interesting, because Moses takes his people away from this tyrannical structure. But they don't go from tyranny to paradise, to the promised land, in one move. That isn't how it works. They go from a tyranny to absolute chaos, where everyone is fighting and killing each other and having a terrible time of it and half starving and having to pass through the Red Sea. They go from tyranny to catastrophe before they go to higher order. And Moses doesn't even make it to the place of higher order. He dies before he gets there. So it's quite the catastrophe. And the Israelites are all confused when they're out in the desert, because even though they were in a tyranny and they were slaves, now they're nowhere and they don't know anything. It's not good. And so a lot of them actually start thinking about how good the damn tyranny was compared to wandering around in the desert, which is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, right? In Russia now there's huge nostalgia for the Stalinist era. So these stories, they're always true, they're always happening. So anyways, what happens to Moses is that the story is quite interesting. So the Israelites start to fight amongst themselves, which of course they do because there's no higher order authority. And so then Moses sits and judges them, like literally like a judge. He sits for hours every day, and the squabbling Israelites come up and say, you know, he did this to me, and no, you did this to me, and so then Moses has to figure out who's right and who's wrong, and he's doing this for like hours and hours, for days and days, for weeks and weeks, for months. It's like the origin of English common law. It's exactly what happened with common law, because in common law what happens is that you have all the rights there are. If you two have a dispute, you go before the judiciary, you sort out the dispute, that becomes a precedent. Now that's part of the body of laws. The body of laws is what you act out. That's why it's a body. Well, that's what Moses does. So he's sitting there making judgments, very, very finely tuned, discrete moral judgments. You know how difficult that is when two people have a dispute, to try to figure out how to mediate between that. You don't know who's lying, who's telling the truth. You don't know exactly what an acceptable solution would be. Like, it's really ridiculously hard work. So he walks through this entire process of continual judicial intermediation. Then he goes up the mountain, and what does he get? A tablet of rules. Well, why? Well, he spent his 10,000 hours investigating the structure of morality in a practical way, and it goes bang, this is what we've been doing, these are the rules. It's not like there's no rules to begin with and those are imposed, because that wouldn't work. It doesn't work that way. You have to take how people are, extract out what the pattern of what they are is, reflect that back to them. Well, that's the story of Moses, and it's a myth, it's a meta story, it's a story about how rules come to be. We act a certain way, we have certain kinds of expectations, we have certain kinds of disputes. Out of that, a pattern way of being emerges. Then we map the patterned way of being. We say, well, look, here's the rules. There's 10 of them, or however many you want to extract, right? I mean, it's a moving target in some sense. Don't kill other people. That's a bad idea. Don't steal what other people have. Honor your parents, etc., etc. I mean, you could come up with a different basic set of rules, but there'd be some overlap, and those aren't bad to begin with. Of course, there were far more rules than that, but those were the central ones. And so then you might say, hey, if you took all 10 of those rules and you tried to extract out one rule from them that would be at the top of the hierarchy, what would that be? And in Western culture, the idea there is that do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the rule that, it's the meta rule that guides all other rules, sort of like the one ring in the Lord of the Rings. And so it's this consistent pattern of abstraction of ethical guidelines. So, okay, so, well, and so that maps onto, well, there's a micro level that you instruct people at, and that then there's a more abstract level that you instruct them at, and then there's a more abstract level. Well, maybe at that point you can't exactly directly instruct them. Remember in the Pinocchio story, Geppetto sits or the cricket, Jiminy, sits Pinocchio down and tries to lecture to him about what the highest level of moral virtue is. He sounds like a complete fraud. He sounds like a propaganda artist. He's a soapbox preacher, and Pinocchio doesn't understand him at all. Why? Has to be acted out. Now, maybe as a parent you can be a model for emulation, which is, so you're a model for imitation. What you say matters, but it doesn't matter as much as what you do. Maybe it would if what you said and what you did were the same. That's the ideal situation, right? That's what you want to do if you're a parent. If you say one thing and act differently, your kids will torture you to death, and they're right to do it too, because you're confused, and confusing them makes them anxious and aggressive, and they will go after you. Consistency, consistency, consistency. And if you can't provide it, you'll drive them crazy. So you want to bring your words and your actions into alignment, right? And that's part of the development of wisdom. So, okay, so back to the brain. All right, so there's the motor homunculus. So now what I want to tell you about that is you just think about what this thing is like. It's taking the world apart.